Hello, everybody, and welcome to Theology 101. Today we are going to begin a new series on the best sermon ever. What is the best sermon ever? It comes from the best preacher of all time, Jesus. He is the Word of God in human flesh. He knows the mind of God better than any one of us, and he teaches in a way that even a child can understand. Jesus preached many sermons, so which one was his best? Well, the way to know is to look at the impact the sermon has left behind. Throughout human history, there is no sermon that has impacted people more than the Sermon on the Mount. Even non-Christian philosophers have admired this sermon. For example, Gandhi said this, "I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ." And a lot of what Gandhi understood about Jesus came from reading the Sermon on the Mount. Even though most people agree that the Sermon on the Mount is the most impactful sermon, Christians do not agree on how to interpret or apply this sermon. During medieval times, some Christians believed that there were two levels of ethics in Jesus' teaching. Jesus taught a certain standard of morality for a common person, but the Sermon on the Mount was a higher standard for those who wanted to be super spiritual. So they believed that the Sermon on the Mount was for those who wanted to be spiritually elite. Later during the Reformation, Martin Luther believed that this sermon functioned like the Old Testament law. In other words, Jesus was revealing God's impossible demands that was meant to drive a person to their knees to cry out for mercy. Luther did not believe that this sermon is something for Christians to apply, but to humble people to turn to Christ. Christian pacifists use this sermon to say that war of all kinds is wrong since Jesus said to turn the other cheek. Some Christians use this sermon as justification for a type of social gospel, referring to doing good works and fighting injustice as the purpose of the Christian faith. Existentialists have rejected taking any of the sermon as absolute truth, but as a challenge to our personal decisions on how we live and encounter God. Finally, there are some forms of Christianity that believe that the sermon only applies to the future kingdom when Jesus returns to reign on earth and is not applicable for Christians today. So considering all these views, how should we interpret and apply this sermon? Just like any other area in Christianity where there is a lot of disagreement, we should carefully see the element of truth from each approach while not adopting one completely. What do I mean? First, nothing in the sermon suggests that Jesus' commands are limited only to a certain group of elite Christians. Second, all the commandments Jesus gave are for his disciples on how they interact with other people within their communities. So questions about pacifism versus war or how the church and state should intersect are legitimate issues, but Jesus does not address them directly. Instead, he addresses his disciples on how they are to relate with others. Now, if Jesus' disciples do follow the principles given in the Sermon on the Mount, their lives should affect society, public policy, the poor, and other issues. However, the purpose of the sermon is not to primarily change structural injustices, but how Jesus' kingdom ethics transforms his disciples. And if Jesus' disciples are transformed by Jesus' kingdom ethics, this should inevitably lead to changes in society as a whole. For example, look at what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." Obeying Jesus' kingdom ethics is never a private matter, but will always be public. This is why people who outlaw slavery in Europe or who fight sex trafficking today are primarily Christians. Third, we also don't see the commandments as only applying to the future kingdom without any relevance for the present. It is true that the perfect expression of Jesus' kingdom ethics will be seen in his future multinational kingdom on earth, but these kingdom commandments are still binding for his disciples who live in the world today. It would be like an American ambassador who is bound by American laws, even if he or she lives in Africa. The tension we find ourselves in is that we are living in a world that does not operate according to Jesus' kingdom ethics. This is why Jesus repeatedly talks about how the world operates versus how his kingdom citizens are supposed to operate. So the kingdom of God fits in an already not yet tension. The kingdom is already here today through the presence of his kingdom citizens, but the kingdom is not yet here until Jesus returns and reigns in Jerusalem and establishes an eternal multinational kingdom. So this sermon matters for us. Even though we cannot live up to the standards Jesus gives in this sermon perfectly, he still wants us to obey him to show the world what his kingdom will look like. Listen, this sermon is is not a way to enter the kingdom. Discernment is not a list of commandments to obey to be justified in the kingdom. Discernment is a picture of what people look like when they are already in his kingdom. Discernment is a picture of what it looks like for those who have already been justified by faith in Jesus. A follower of Jesus cannot say, I already trust in Jesus, so I don't need to live out discernment. No, a disciple of Jesus will realize that since they have been justified, they must now listen and obey their king and reflect the righteousness that Jesus has given to them through their faith. And a person who is not a follower of Jesus, after listening to the sermon, they will see that their righteousness falls short of the righteousness Jesus describes. And either this person will respond by turning away from their own righteousness and trusting in Jesus, or this person will think that they can eventually live up to this standard by their own efforts, even though they can't. So now that we established how we should interpret and apply this sermon, let me go over the structure of the sermon. The sermon opens in Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 to 12 with the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes are declarations of blessings one experiences in God's kingdom. Jesus is providing kingdom blessings for those who are in his kingdom and shows the character of what his kingdom citizens look like. Just like the Ten Commandments gave a picture of the overall nature of the laws of the Mosaic covenant, Jesus gives the Beatitudes as a snapshot of the overall nature of his kingdom laws. Then Jesus concludes the introduction of this sermon with the salt and light metaphors, which shows us that kingdom citizens will have an effect in this world today. Then we arrive at the thesis of the sermon. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Why do I say this is a thesis? Because Jesus is trying to show us that his kingdom is not something contradictory to the Old Testament laws. It is an expansion upon it and a fulfillment of it. After giving his thesis, Jesus will now expound on what his kingdom righteousness looks like. He will contrast the teaching with the Old Testament laws in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 to 48, with 6 contrasts. You heard the law say this, but I say this. Again, Jesus is not abolishing the law or negating it. He is affirming it and showing the full implications of the law. He is showing that his kingdom laws will express the full righteousness God intended Israel to live out through the Mosaic law. Then Jesus concludes his sermon with 3 illustrations of the only 2 responses to the sermon. Every listener will either enter the narrow gate, which is difficult to find, or continue to walk on the path that is easy but leads to destruction. Either they will bear good fruit or they will bear diseased fruit. Either they will build their house on a rock such that their house will never fall, or they will continue to build their house on sand, which will fall. Do you see the progression of Jesus' sermon? Jesus opens with the picture of the type of person who is part of his kingdom. He describes their effect on society. He describes the type of righteousness this person lives by. Then he concludes by saying that this person will respond to his sermon a certain way. I pray that we will be the type of person Jesus described as those who live according to his kingdom standards. Thank you to today's sponsor, On Reverence. They offer a free digital worship music app called Maskill. If you want to find out more, I'll leave some links below in the description box. Until next time, see you.